All right, so are you ready to jump into Ruby on Rails? We're going deep with Agile Web Development with Rails 5 to really get what makes this framework tick.
Yeah, this book is like essential reading for Rails developers. It really nails that whole Rails
It
philosophy.
really does, and we're going all in the why, the how, from its Agile roots and that MVC architecture to seeing it all come together in real-world apps. Get ready.
Whether you just need a little refresher or you're finally tackling those Rails concepts, we've got you.
Okay, so imagine this. You start a web app project and boom, functional app right out of the gate. It's like Rails is magic.
It's that convention over configuration. Yeah.
Exactly. But it's not actually magic, is it? It's more like Rails took all the best practices, all the things developers were doing over and over, and just baked them right in.
Saves everyone a ton of time and headaches.
Talk about a productivity boost. And since we're talking about working smarter, Rails is all about DRY. Don't repeat yourself.
Which seems obvious now, but the book really highlights how revolutionary that was. Back then, developers were stuck with frameworks where even a tiny change meant updating code all over the place.
Oh, I can only imagine. So less repetition, streamlined setup, and on top of that, the book itself embodies that whole agile approach. It walks you through actually building a real online store application called Depot.
I love how practical that is. You're not stuck in theory land, you're learning by doing. You've got code examples for product validations, building a dynamic catalog, even using AJX to make the user experience super smooth.
The Depot app sounds like a gold mine of knowledge. Seeing how it all comes together in a real-world scenario is so valuable.
Totally. It's like having an experienced developer right there with you, guiding you every step of the way.
I like that. Now, for those wondering about the language behind all this Rails magic, that would be the elegant Ruby.
And don't worry if Ruby's new to you. The book eases you in with the essentials arrays, hashes, blocks, the important stuff. You'll quickly see how its flexibility and expressiveness make Rails so powerful.
It's like unlocking a whole new level of web development. And here's something that blew my mind. Rails isn't just for websites.
Right. That's what's so cool about it. Active Record, which is at the core of how Rails interacts with databases, can be used for so much more than just web apps.
Wait, seriously, I always thought it was all about websites and web applications. Like, what else can you do with it?
Think of any task where you're working with data standalone scripts, background tasks, data processing, you name it. Active Record can be a really powerful tool for all of that.
That's wild. It's like a Swiss Army knife for data management.
Exactly. It all goes back to that Rails philosophy of building versatile tools that you can adapt to a ton of different tasks.
So we've got this framework that's big on conventions but doesn't want to limit you. How does Rails handle customization, especially for something like our Depot app?
That's where plugins come in. Rails has this huge ecosystem of plugins that opens up a world of possibilities. Like in the book, they use Active Merchant for payment processing, which is super practical.
Makes sense. What about for developers who prefer a different templating language?
They've got that covered too. The book introduces Hamley as an alternative and even walks you through integrating it.
That's awesome. It really shows how adaptable Rails can be.
Exactly. It's all about empowering developers, not putting them in a box.
Speaking of empowering developers, I was really impressed with how much the book emphasizes testing right from the start, especially unit testing for the Depot applications models.
Absolutely. It's not just about building features, it's about building them the right way, and unit testing is crucial for that.
And they use many tests, which is great because it's already included with Ruby. Developers can just dive right into testing without any extra hurdles.
Exactly. And they don't just tell you to test, they show you how. In the Depot app, they walk you through creating unit tests for the product model, ensuring it handles those required fields, data validation, all that critical stuff.
That's what I love about this book, and it's practical. They're not just throwing jargon around. They give you the tools and the knowledge to actually use these concepts.
For example, they use test fixtures, which are like predefined data scenarios, to simulate different situations the model might encounter in the real world.
That's really clever. It's like giving your code a test drive with different scenarios, making sure it can handle whatever you throw at it.
Exactly. And they even show you how to test really specific things like making sure product titles are unique, that prices are actually numbers, and even that image URLs are formatted correctly.
Talk about attention to detail. It's clear they thought of everything.
Right. It's not just about building an app. It's about building an app that's bid to last.
For sure. And these test fixtures we've been talking about, they highlight a really interesting challenge in web development: data persistence.
Because web applications are all about data, right?
Yep.
We're constantly storing it, retrieving it, making changes to it.
Exactly. And that's where databases come in. In this section of the book, they use SQL 3 for the Depot app, which makes a lot of sense, right?
Absolutely. Especially for a learning example, Squite 3 is already built right into Ruby, so it keeps things nice and simple, letting you really focus on the core concepts.
Makes sense. So where does Active Record fit into all of this?
This is where Active Record really shines. It acts like this bridge between our Ruby code and the database. It lets us interact with the database in a way that feels much more natural and intuitive.
It's like having a translator who's fluent in both Ruby and database languages.
Exactly. No more wrestling with those clunky SQL queries. You get to use Ruby-like syntax to do all your database operations.
That's so powerful. It really simplifies the whole process. So they're using Active Record to create, retrieve, update, and delete product information within the Depot app's database.
Exactly. And they provide really specific code examples for finding products, not just by their primary keys, but by constructing more complex queries too, like finding all products in a certain category or those within a specific price range.
That's where the real power of Active Record comes in, right? It's not just about simple lookups.
Absolutely. It provides this really elegant, expressive way to define those complex queries without writing a single line of raw SQL.
Talk about DRY code in action. You're not repeating those SQL queries all over your code base. Active Record keeps it clean, maintainable, and efficient.
It's all about working smarter, not harder, remember? And it really shows how Rails empowers developers to focus on the big picture instead of getting bogged down in the little details.
Okay, so we've got our database set up. We're talking to it with Active Record. But what about the elephant in the room, security? Specifically, what about those nasty SQL injection attacks?
Yes, security. One of the things I appreciate about this book is how it tackles these security concerns head on.
Because those SQL injection attacks can be a real nightmare.
Tell me about it. But the good news is Rails has built-in protection against SQL injection through Active Record's query interface. And they do a fantastic job of explaining how it works and why it's so important.
So Active Record isn't just about convenience, it's about security too. That's a huge relief.
Absolutely. It's like having a security guard posted up at your database, making sure that only valid and safe queries get through.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So our data is secure, we're interacting with it elegantly, but what about those little tweaks and actions we need to perform at specific points? How does Rails handle that?
That's where callbacks swoop in to save the day. Think of them like hooks into the lifecycle of Active Record.
Hooks. Like what?
They let you execute custom code at very specific points. So say before saving a record to the database or right after updating a record, that kind of thing.
That's incredibly useful. It's
Yeah.
like having these little helpers that automatically take care of things behind the scenes.
Exactly. For example, let's say you need to validate some data before it gets saved to the database, or maybe you need to trigger an external action when something in the database changes. Callbacks are your go-to tool for that.
So instead of writing all this extra code manually, callbacks let you focus on the bigger picture. That's brilliant.
Exactly. It's all about streamlining your workflow and making your code more efficient.
And since we're talking efficiency, let's shift gears to the front end, the face of our application. We've laid a solid foundation with the database and models, but what about presenting that data to the user in a way that's both functional and visually appealing?
That's where Rails Action View comes in. It's the engine behind Rails views, and it's all about making the process of creating those HTML templates as smooth as butter.
Okay, so when we're talking about views in Rails, we're talking about those ERB templates, the files with the .erb extension, right?
ERB stands for Embedded Ruby, and it's what lets us seamlessly blend HTML with Ruby code right there in our templates.
So it's like having the best of both worlds. You get the structure and familiarity of HTML, but with the power and flexibility of Ruby sprinkled in.
Precisely. And the book is packed with examples of how to leverage ERB displaying dynamic content, looping through collections of data, even handling conditional logic.
It's like taking those static HTML templates and injecting them with dynamic Ruby power.
Exactly. And to keep those templates nice and organized, Rails introduces this concept of helpers.
So helpers are like little snippets of reusable code that we can define to handle specific tasks within our views.
You got it. Let's say you have this complex calculation for formatting data that you need to display in multiple views. Instead of repeating that code everywhere, you define it once as a helper, and then just call that helper from your templates.
That's a game changer for code reusability. It all comes back to working smarter, not harder. Seems like a recurring theme with Rails, huh?
Absolutely. Rails is all about efficiency, and helpers are a perfect example of that philosophy in action. They keep your code DRY organized and easy to maintain.
So we've got our dynamic content under control. What about the visual side of things? Because no one wants a website that looks like it's stuck in the 90s.
You're preaching to the choir. The book actually goes into using CSS to give the Depot application a more modern look and feel. They even get into nested CSS rules to keep everything organized and maintainable.
Nested CSS. Music to my ears. That makes a huge difference when you're dealing with complex style sheets.
Right. And they don't stop there. They even sprinkle in some SAS syntactically awesome style sheets.
SAS.
Yeah.
Okay, for those who might not be familiar, what is SAS and why is it so awesome?
Imagine CSS, but with superpowers. SAS adds all these cool features like variables, nesting, which we just touched on, and mixins, which are like reusable blocks of styles. It makes your CSS so much more concise, organized, and efficient.
It's like taking CSS to a whole new level. It's amazing how Rails integrates with all these different tools and technologies to empower developers to build these beautiful and functional web applications.
Exactly. It's about creating this cohesive and enjoyable development experience.
So we've got this good-looking app. It's well-tested, but it's not much use if it's just sitting on our local machine, right?
Yeah.
We need to get this thing out into the world.
Time for deployment. It's often the trickiest part. But don't worry, the book gives you a solid roadmap for getting that Depot app up and running on a real production server.
They cover it all. Setting up a web server like Apache or Nginx, configuring the database for production, even using tools like Capistrano for automated deployments.
Capistrano is a lifesaver. It handles all those tedious deployment tasks, copying files, restarting servers, running database migrations so you don't have to.
Like having a dedicated deployment assistant. They even highlight best practices, like using a version control system, which honestly should be a given for any development project these days.
Absolutely. Version control is non-negotiable. It's not just about collaboration, it's about having a safety net, you know? If something goes wrong, you can easily roll back to a previous version.
Speaking of making life easier, let's talk about internationalization. The web's a global place, so building apps that cater to a global audience is crucial.
For sure. And Rails makes internationalization surprisingly easy.
They introduced the idea of locales, which are basically configuration files that hold translations for different languages.
Right. So instead of hard-coding text directly into your application, you use these placeholders that get replaced with the correct translations based on the user's locale.
That's really cool. And it's not just for static text either. They show you how to translate model attributes, validation messages, practically everything.
Exactly. It's about making your application truly speak to a global audience, and Rails provides all the tools to do it effectively.
Now, earlier, you blew my mind when you said that Rails isn't just limited to web applications. Can you elaborate on that a bit? Like, what other cool things can we do with Rails that go beyond the browser?
Remember Active Record, our database superhero? Well, it turns out Active Record can be used for a whole lot more than just building those traditional web apps.
Really? So we're not just talking about websites and web apps. We can use Rails for any task that involves data.
You got it. Data processing, interacting with APIs, even automating system administration tasks. There's a lot you can do.
That's incredible. It's like discovering a hidden superpower.
It really is. And it's all thanks to the versatility of Active Record and the power of Ruby.
They even walk you through setting up a standalone Ruby script that connects to the database and manipulates data using Active Record, just like you would in a web application.
Exactly. It really demonstrates how Rails can be used for so much more than just traditional web development.
This is mind-blowing. I love how versatile and powerful Rails is.
Me too. And you know what else is awesome about Rails? The community.
Oh, the Rails community is legendary. They're incredibly supportive, welcoming, and always willing to lend a helping hand. It's such a breath of fresh air compared to some other communities out there.
Right. It's like one big, happy, helpful family. They're constantly building amazing things, creating plugins, sharing their knowledge. The book even gives us a glimpse into this plugin world, mentioning popular ones like Active Merchant for payment processing, which we talked about earlier, and Haml for those who prefer a different way to write their templates.
It's incredible how much innovation is happening in the Rails world.
And it's all thanks to that passionate and collaborative community. They're the best.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about community, we've talked about versatility, but let's talk about something near and dear to every developer's heart: debugging. We all run into those pesky bugs from time to time. What does Rails have up its sleeve to make our lives easier in that department?
Oh man, get ready to have your mind blown because Rails has this amazing tool called the Web Console. It's like having an interactive playground right inside your browser.
An interactive playground. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
It's basically a REPL that stands for Read Evil Print Loop, but it runs right there in your browser. You can inspect variables, run snippets of code, even interact with your database in real time, all while your application's running.
That sounds incredibly helpful for hunting down those really tricky bugs.
Yeah.
No more littering your code with put statements and hoping for the best.
Exactly. And it's not just for debugging either. You can use it to play around with the Rails API, experiment with different code snippets, just get a better feel for how things work under the hood.
It's like having X-ray vision right into your Rails application.
Right. It's so powerful. And it's just another way Rails goes above and beyond to make that development experience as smooth and enjoyable as possible.
Speaking of smooth sailing, let's talk about managing changes to our database structure over time. Because databases are like living, breathing things. They're constantly changing and evolving as our applications grow.
Absolutely. And that's where migrations step in. Migrations are like version control for your database schema.
Version control for your database, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So instead of manually updating the database structure every time something changes, we use migrations to track those changes and apply them in a more controlled way.
Exactly. And Rails makes it incredibly easy to create and manage these migrations. They walk you through creating a migration using Rails built-in generators. You'll even learn how to define up and down methods to handle both applying and reverting changes to the database.
It's like having an undo button for your database. If something goes wrong, you can just revert to a previous state.
Exactly. And they even touch upon more advanced migration techniques, like using data migrations to actually modify existing data in the database.
So it's not just about changing the structure. It's about manipulating the data itself.
Right.
That's really powerful.
Right.
It's clear that migrations are essential for anyone working with databases in Rails.
Absolutely. They give you that structured and controlled way to manage your database changes, which makes your life as a developer so much easier.
And it all ties back to that Rails philosophy of convention over configuration,
Yeah.
right? Make those sensible assumptions, provide sensible defaults, and streamline that development process.
Exactly. Rails is all about making the easy things easy and the hard things possible.
Now, we've talked about a lot of Rails core features, but one of the things that really sets it apart is this underlying philosophy of convention over configuration.
It's a big reason why so many developers absolutely love Rails, I think. It's like Rails just understands how you think and what you're trying to accomplish.
And it anticipates your needs, right? Providing those sensible defaults and conventions so you can spend less time fighting with the framework and more time building your application.
Exactly. Like in Rails, you don't have to waste time manually mapping your model classes to database tables. Rails just takes care of that for you based on naming conventions.
That's incredible. It saves so much time and headaches.
For sure. And it reduces the potential for errors. It's like having a personal assistant who handles all those tedious tasks for you, freeing you up to focus on the creative and challenging parts of development.
So convention over configuration is all about reducing boilerplate code, streamlining that development process, and ultimately just making developers' lives easier.
Exactly. It's about working smarter, not harder, which, as we've said, is one of the core principles that makes Rails such a joy to work with.
You know, there's one term they mentioned in the book that I have to admit kind of threw me for a loop, the Rails engine. It sounds kind of mysterious, doesn't it?
It does, a little. Think of the Rails engine as like the maestro of an orchestra. It's working behind the scenes, coordinating all those different parts of Rails, making sure they all work together in harmony.
So it's like the glue that holds everything together. We don't necessarily interact with it directly, but it's essential for everything to function properly.
Exactly. It handles things like routing requests, dispatching actions to controllers, rendering those views, just managing the overall life cycle of our application.
So it's really the heart and soul of the framework, even though we don't see it.
Yeah. And while we don't always need to dive into the inner workings of the Rails engine, I think it's helpful to have at least a basic understanding of what it does and how it contributes to making Rails tick.
For sure. Speaking of different parts working together, the book talks about this idea of environments in Rails.
Environments are like different modes of operation for your application. You'll probably work with development, test, and production the most.
So it's like having different settings depending on whether we're coding, testing, or running the application live.
Exactly. Each environment comes with its own set of configurations and settings. In development, for instance, you might want more detailed logging and debugging tools enabled, while in production, you're focused on performance and security.
That makes sense. So Rails makes it easy to switch between these different environments, right?
Absolutely. You can use command line flags or even environment variables to easily switch between them.
That's super convenient.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. It's all about making that development process as smooth and efficient as possible.
Exactly. Speaking of handy tools, the book introduces us to the Rails Runner command.
Rails Runner. Okay, that one's new to me. What's that all about?
So basically, it lets you run any arbitrary Ruby code within the context of your Rails application.
Wow, so it's like having a direct line to our Rails app where we can execute any Ruby code we want.
You got it. In the book, they use it to load sample data, but you can use it for all sorts of things, running background tasks, processing data, interacting with external services. It's really versatile.
That's incredibly powerful, like having a Swiss Army knife for our Rails application.
Precisely. It's another great example of how versatile Rails is and how many tools it provides to make our lives as developers easier.
All right, so we've built our application, we've deployed it, and users are out there using it. But how do we keep an eye on things, especially when something goes wrong?
Monitoring. That's where those trusty log files come in handy. They're like the diary of our application, recording everything that's going on. Errors, warnings, debugging information, you name it.
So it's like having a window into the inner workings of our application.
Precisely. And the book emphasizes how important it is to regularly check those log files, not just when something breaks, but as a preventative measure.
That's good advice. It's always better to catch those issues early on rather than wait for them to turn into major problems.
Absolutely. And they even give you some tips on managing those log files because they can get pretty big over time. They talk about log rotation, which is basically a way to automatically archive and compress those older log files so they don't eat up all your disk space.
That's really helpful. It's all about having that proactive approach to monitoring and maintenance.
Exactly. And, as always, Rails provides the tools and mechanisms you need to do it effectively.
Now, we've talked about logging, but what about keeping our code organized as our applications start to grow? Because it's really easy for things to turn into a tangled mess if we're not careful.
You're telling me. That's why Rails emphasizes using namespaces.
Namespaces, those are like folders for our code, right?
Precisely. They help us group related code together, which makes our code base much more manageable. It's easier to navigate and less prone to those annoying naming conflicts.
That makes a lot of sense, especially as our applications become more and more complex. So how do we use namespaces in Rails?
It's super easy. Rails makes it a breeze. You can define your own namespaces, and Rails itself uses namespaces extensively to structure its own code base.
So they practice what they preach. That's great to hear. It's one thing to tell developers to use namespaces. It's another thing entirely to show them how it's done in a real-world framework.
Right. And it's not just a Rails thing either. Namespaces are common practice in a lot of programming languages, and for good reason.
They're essential for keeping your code base clean, organized, and maintainable, especially as your project starts to grow.
Think of it this way. Would you rather search for a needle in a haystack or in a well-organized toolbox?
I'd take the toolbox any day,
Uh-huh.
especially if it's as well organized as a Rails application built using namespaces.
Exactly.
Now, we've talked about organizing our code, but what about making sure that the data we're working with is accurate and reliable?
Data validation. That's another area where Rails really shines.
And they dive into this in the book, right?
Yeah.
They talk about using active record validations.
Exactly. Active record validations are so elegant. They offer this robust way to enforce data integrity right within your Rails application.
So we can define specific rules for our model attributes, making sure that the data being saved to the database meets our criteria.
Precisely. And Rails gives you a ton of validation options, from simple presence checks to more complex validations like email format, uniqueness, numerical ranges. It's really comprehensive.
It's like having a bouncer at the door of your database,
Yeah.
only letting in the data that meets your standards.
I love that. And they don't stop at just predefined validations either. They show you how to define your own custom validation methods so you can handle even the most complex scenarios.
So much flexibility.
Exactly. It's all about giving developers the tools they need to build robust and reliable applications.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about something that can really make or break a user's experience, error handling.
Yes, errors. They're an inevitable part of software development. The key is to handle them gracefully so they don't crash our whole application.
And Rails provides a really elegant way to do that, right?
It does. They talk about using rescue blocks to catch those exceptions and how to set up custom error pages so that if something goes wrong, the user sees a friendly message instead of that dreaded wall of technical jargon.
So instead of the application completely crashing and burning, we can gracefully intercept those errors and display a helpful message. Maybe even suggest a course of action.
Exactly. It's all about creating that seamless and enjoyable user experience, even when things go wrong.
They even mention the importance of logging those errors so you can go back and analyze what happened.
Absolutely. Logging is so crucial for tracking down and fixing those issues, especially the ones that aren't immediately obvious.
Like having a detective on the case, piecing together those clues.
That's a great way to put it. And thankfully, Rails makes it easy to integrate logging into your applications.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of Rails core features, but one of the things that truly sets it apart is its incredible extensibility. The book really digs into the world of plugins and gems, these reusable packages of code that can add so much amazing functionality to your Rails applications.
Plugins and gems are like superpowers for your Rails apps. They let you add all these new features, integrate with external services, and just benefit from the work of thousands of talented developers.
It's like having access to this giant toolbox full of pre-built components that you can easily plug into your application.
Exactly. And Rails makes it super easy to find, install, and manage these plugins and gems using a tool called Bundler.
Bundler, okay. I've heard the name but never really looked into it. Tell me more.
Bundler is like a package manager just for your Rails applications. It keeps track of all the gems your app depends on, makes sure you have the right versions, and makes installing and updating them a breeze.
That sounds incredibly useful, especially when you're working on large projects with a bunch of different dependencies.
Oh, it's a lifesaver. Bundler takes all the headache out of managing dependencies in your Rails projects.
So we've got this amazing framework. It's extensible. It's got this fantastic community. But what about interacting with other applications? Because the web is all about interconnectedness these days.
Exactly. And Rails makes it really easy to interact with external APIs, which stands for Application Programming Interface. In the book, they talk about using gems like REST Client and HTTP Party to make those API requests from our Rails applications.
So API requests are essentially just a way for applications to talk to each other over the internet, right? Like sending messages and getting data back.
Exactly. And these gems take care of all the low-level details of making HTTP requests, parsing the responses, and handling all those different data formats. So you can just focus on the logic of interacting with that external service.
It's like having a dedicated translator who speaks both Rails and whatever language the other application is using.
Right. And they don't just stop at the basics either. They get into handling different API authentication mechanisms like API keys. Think of them like passwords for applications, and Oath, which is a more secure way to grant access to user data without actually sharing their passwords.
Security is always crucial. It's good to know that Rails has tools and techniques for ensuring our interactions with external APIs are safe and sound.
Absolutely. Security is always a top priority. And it's another example of how Rails encourages developers to follow those best practices.
So it's not just about building web services that work. It's about building web services that are secure, reliable, and trustworthy.
Precisely. And while Rails provides a solid foundation for building secure services, it's on us, the developers, to stay informed, follow those best practices, and make sure our applications are protected.
That makes sense. Now, we've talked about user authentication, authorization, even interacting with other applications through APIs. What about tasks that we might not want to slow down our application? Tasks that might take a while, like sending emails or processing large amounts of data.
That's where background jobs come to the rescue. Background jobs let you offload those time-consuming tasks to run in the background so they don't block the main thread of your application.
So instead of making the user wait for these longer tasks to finish, we can push them into the background and let the application keep running smoothly.
Exactly. Think of it like this. You've got your front of house staff focused on providing a seamless customer experience, and then you have a dedicated team working behind the scenes to take care of those other tasks.
I love that analogy. So how do we implement these background jobs in Rails?
The book introduces a couple of popular gems for this, like Sidekick and Resk. These gems provide this really robust and scalable way to manage those background jobs.
So we can just hand off those tasks to Sidekick or Resk, and they take care of everything.
Exactly. They handle all that queuing, processing, error handling, everything involved in running background jobs, so you can focus on other things.
That sounds like a developer's dream.
Right. It's like having a dedicated team of asynchronous ninjas working behind the scenes to keep your app running smoothly. It really is. It's all about making our lives as developers easier, right? So we can focus on those high-level things.
Absolutely. So we've got background jobs humming along, making sure our applications are snappy and responsive. But what about making those applications even faster? I'm talking about the magic of caching.
Caching. It's one of those things that can make a huge difference in web applications.
It's like magic, but for websites. The book really digs into caching and how essential it is for web app performance. Can you give us a quick rundown?
Sure. Caching is basically about storing frequently accessed information in a more readily available location so you don't have to keep retrieving it from the original, slower source every single time.
So it's all about speeding things up, making things feel snappier for the user?
Exactly. It's like if you constantly need a certain phone number, it's way faster to jot it down on a sticky note than to keep digging through the phone book, right?
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
So how does this translate to building web applications with Rails?
Well, Rails actually has built-in support for a few different types of caching. They talk about page caching, which stores the entire rendered HTML of a page. Then there's fragment caching for caching just portions of a page, and action caching, which stores the results of specific controller actions.
Wow, so many options. Sounds like Rails gives you a lot of control over what and how you cache.
Yeah, definitely. And they even get into using external caching systems like Memcached and Redis if you need some serious caching firepower.
So you can start with Rails built-in caching, and if you need to scale up, those options are there.
Exactly. It's all about having the right tool for the job
Right.
and scaling things up as needed.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got caching covered, but what about making our applications, especially those dealing with tons of data, even more user-friendly? I'm thinking about search functionality.
Oh, search is huge. And thankfully, the book doesn't disappoint there. They actually talk about integrating really powerful search engines like Elasticsearch and Solr into your Rails apps.
Okay, now those are some names I've definitely heard before. Elasticsearch and Solr, they're like the big leagues when it comes to search, right?
Yeah.
What makes them so special?
They're built from the ground up to handle massive amounts of data and give you those super fast search results. Think searching through a catalog of millions of products or finding a specific article in a huge news archive. That's where they really shine.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
So if we want to build that kind of search functionality into our Rails applications, how do we even begin to integrate with these search engines?
Well, true to Rails form, there are gems for that. They mention Elasticsearch Rails and Sunspot Rails as great options.
So thankfully, we don't have to reinvent the wheel and write all that code ourselves.
Exactly. These gems handle all that complex integration stuff for you. It's all about working smarter, not harder.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned those search engines are great for handling huge data sets, but what about searching within the content of the data itself? Not just the title or description.
You're talking about full text search. And don't worry, Rails has you covered there too.
Oh, good, because that's a game changer for users.
Right. The book talks about plugins like Access Index and Thinking Sphinx that bring full text search capabilities right into your Rails applications.
It's like having a superpower that lets you search through your entire database instantly.
Pretty much. And with the right setup, it can be surprisingly fast and efficient.
So we've got caching, we've got powerful search rails. Really does seem to have an answer for everything. But what about those really dynamic, modern web apps? The ones with features like real-time chat, notifications, those sorts of things.
I know what you mean. Real-time features can really elevate a web application.
They can, but they also sound really tricky to build.
They can be. But luckily, Rails is up for the challenge. The book gets into using WebSockets, which are perfect for building these real-time features.
WebSockets. Now, that's a term I've heard thrown around, but to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
So, WebSockets give you this direct, persistent connection between the user's browser and the server.
Okay, that's different from how websites usually work, right?
Exactly. And it's what makes real-time features possible. With WebSockets, the server can actually push updates to the user's browser instantly without needing constant page refreshes or that annoying polling.
So everything feels much more instant and seamless for the user. No more hitting refresh every 5 seconds.
Exactly. And Rails makes working with WebSockets even easier with Action Cable.
Action cable. Okay, that one's ringing a bell. Isn't that something built into Rails specifically for real-time stuff?
You know it. Action Cable handles all that WebSocket magic for you. It's a framework within Rails that makes building real-time features so much simpler.
So it takes care of the complex parts of WebSockets, like managing all the connections and making sure data gets sent to the right places.
Exactly. You don't have to wrangle with the low-level stuff. It's all about making it easy to build awesome real-time experiences for your users.
That's awesome. And like with everything else, they make sure to emphasize testing those real-time features.
Always test. Especially with real-time features, you want to be extra sure everything's working perfectly. Any hiccups there can really impact the user's experience.
For sure. It's not just about the code working, it's about the whole experience feeling polished. Okay, we've covered a ton about performance, features, user experience, but let's not forget about the foundation of it all, security.
So important, and the book really dives into security best practices for Rails applications.
Because building secure applications from the get-go is always better than trying to bolt on security after the fact.
100%. They cover everything from cross-site scripting and SQL injection to session hijacking, all the big ones.
They basically created a security checklist for Rails developers.
Right. It's great. They really stress building those secure habits early on. Like, validating user input is huge. They go over all sorts of techniques for sanitizing data and preventing those nasty injection attacks.
Never trust user input. It's like rule number one.
You got it. They also talk a lot about securing your database connections because that's another prime target for attackers.
And then there are those more common attack vectors that we always need to be on the lookout for.
Right. Like cross-site scripting, where someone tries to sneak malicious code into your website. They cover that in detail, and they highlight some tools that can help, too. Wakeman and Rack Protection. They act like security guards for your code.
It's like having an automatic security audit happening right in your development workflow.
Exactly. It's all about being proactive. Make those secure coding practices second nature.
So it sounds like in the Rails world, security is not just a box to check. It's deeply ingrained in the whole development philosophy.
Absolutely. It's about building that secure foundation right from the start.
Love that. Okay, now along with security, there's another thing that's always top of mind for developers. Performance optimization. Users today expect things to be fast, and if your website is slow, they won't stick around.
Nope, they won't. Speed is everything these days, and the book has a whole section about techniques to make those Rails apps faster and more efficient.
Okay, I'm ready for those speed-boosting tips.
Yeah.
What kind of optimization strategies are we talking about?
They start with the database, which makes sense, right? Optimizing database queries is key, and so is indexing.
The database is like the heart of most web applications.
Exactly. They even show you how to write more efficient queries, which can make a huge difference.
I bet. What else?
Caching, we already touched on that. But there's also code profiling, which helps you find the bottlenecks in your application's code.
It's like giving your code a performance review.
Exactly. And if you really want to get into the weeds, they mention some performance monitoring tools like New Relic and Skylight.
I've heard of those. They're super helpful, especially when your application starts to grow and it's not so easy to keep track of everything that's going on.
They're lifesavers. It's great to see how the Rails community is always creating new tools and coming up with these best practices to help everyone build super high-performing applications.
Well, you mentioned applications growing, which brings up another challenge: scaling. As your user base grows, you've got to make sure your application can handle it.
Scaling is tough. It's one of the biggest hurdles in web development, but the book does a good job of explaining the different ways you can scale your Rails applications.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of those strategies?
Well, they start with the simplest approach, upgrading your server hardware, which is sometimes called vertical scaling. It's a good first step, but it only gets you so far, you know?
Right, eventually one server just isn't enough.
Exactly. And that's where horizontal scaling comes in. That's when you distribute your application across multiple servers so you can handle a lot more traffic.
Sounds way more complex, but also way more powerful if you can pull it off.
It definitely can be. But luckily, there are tools and technologies that can help. The book even talks about using cloud platforms like Heroku and AWS to make it easier to scale your application on demand.
That's amazing. So you can easily add more servers when you need them, like during a traffic spike, and then scale back down when things calm down. So efficient.
Exactly. It's all about that flexibility and efficiency.
And it really highlights how well Rails is suited for today's web applications, which is great to see. Now, we can't talk about Rails without talking about its incredible community. The book definitely doesn't shy away from emphasizing that.
It's true. The Rails community is one of the best things about working with Rails. It's incredibly welcoming and supportive. They're a special bunch.
What do you think makes the Rails community so unique?
It's that shared passion, you know? Everyone's just really excited about building elegant, maintainable web applications, and they're happy to share what they know. People are constantly helping each other out, contributing to open source projects. It's great.
Sounds like a really positive and collaborative environment.
It really is. They have fantastic resources too, like online forums, mailing lists, conferences, and meetups all over the place. It's easy to connect with people and learn.
I love that. The book actually encourages people to get involved in the community, doesn't it?
Totally. Contributing is so important, whether it's writing code for open source projects, sharing what you've learned on your blog, or even just answering questions in a forum. It all makes a difference.
It's a two-way street. You learn from others, and you give back by sharing your own knowledge and experiences.
Exactly. The Rails community is a perfect example of how powerful that can be.
Couldn't agree more. They also mentioned this really cool initiative in the book Rails Girls.
Oh yeah, Rails Girls. They're fantastic. They're an international nonprofit group that teaches women to code, specifically using Ruby on Rails.
I love it. We definitely need more women in tech.
Absolutely. It's amazing to see Rails Girls breaking down those barriers.
It's a good reminder that tech is for everyone. So we've got this awesome supportive community, a framework that seems to do it all, but it's a fast-paced industry. What about the future of Rails? How does it keep up?
That's the thing about Rails. It's always evolving.
Yeah.
The book talks about how the framework is constantly adapting to new technology and trends, which is how it's stayed relevant for so long.
So it's not just about learning Rails as it exists today. It's about understanding the underlying principles so you can adapt as Rails evolves.
Exactly. They actually highlight some of the cool recent advancements like Action Cable, which we talked about earlier for real-time features, Turbo Links, which makes page transitions super fast, and Stimulus for building those really dynamic front-end interactions.
Like Rails is a constantly evolving, leveling up kind of thing.
Totally. They even touch on using JavaScript frameworks like React and Vue.js alongside Rails to build even more complex web applications.
So it's not a case of Rails or JavaScript. It's about picking the best tools for the job and using them together effectively.
That's the beauty of it. It's adaptable. Rails isn't trying to be a one-size-fits-all solution. It's about giving you a solid foundation that you can then build on and customize.
I love that. Now, we've thrown around this acronym MVC a bunch today. Can we break down why this model view controller pattern is so central to Rails?
It's essential. It's like the blueprint for how Rails applications are structured and how they stay organized.
Right, because as applications grow, things can get messy fast if you don't have good architecture.
Exactly. MVC helps you separate those different concerns within your application, which makes it easier to build, maintain, and test everything. And each part of MVC has a specific job, which keeps things running smoothly.
So let's break it down, starting with model.
The model is all about your data and the logic associated with it. It's like the brains of the whole operation.
So data validation, relationships between different bits of data, that's all handled by the model.
You got it. It's not just about storing data. It's about making sure that data is accurate and consistent within the context of your application.
Then we have the view, right? So that's what the user actually sees.
Right. The view takes the data from the model and presents it to the user. It's what generates the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that makes your application come alive in the browser.
So it's all about presentation. The view takes that raw data and turns it into something the user can actually digest and interact with.
Exactly. And then last but not least, we have the controller, which acts as that intermediary between the model and the view.
So it's like the traffic cop directing the flow of information and requests.
Yes. The controller takes those requests from the user, interacts with the model to get the necessary data, and then sends that data off to the view for presentation.
It's the glue that holds it all together.
I like that. And this whole idea of separating concerns, having the model, the view, and the controller each doing their own thing, that's one of the most important concepts in Rails, in my opinion.
It makes a lot of sense. So it's a pattern that stood the test of time.
It has. And it's not just a Rails thing either. Even if you end up working with other web frameworks, understanding MVC will give you a huge advantage.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier that Rails is built with RESTful web services in mind. The book talks about REST too. Could you unpack that a bit? What's
Yeah.
so special about REST?
Okay, so REST, which stands for Representational State Transfer, is all about using standard HTTP verbs. Those are the actions we use to communicate over the web, like get to retrieve data, post to create data, put for updating, and delete for, well, deleting.
So it's like a universal language for interacting with resources on the web.
Exactly. And Rails just clicks with REST. It makes building RESTful web services incredibly intuitive.
They actually show you how to do it in the book, right?
Yeah, they walk you through using Rails routing system to connect those RESTful actions. Get, post, put, delete to specific methods in your controllers, which makes building web services super streamlined.
The book makes it sound really elegant how it all comes together.
It is, and that elegance is why RESTful web services are everywhere. They're easy to understand, they're predictable, and that consistency makes it easier for different applications to talk to each other.
So it's not just about building a Rails application in isolation. It's about building a Rails application that can play nicely with all those other web services.
Exactly, and that's another way Rails helps developers build powerful and well-integrated applications.
Now, speaking of integration, web applications often need to work with data that comes from all sorts of different places, right? And that data might be formatted in different ways.
Oh, for sure. Data formats can be a real headache. Two of the most common ones you'll come across are XML and JSON.
Okay, so XML has been around for a while, hasn't it?
It has. XML, which stands for Extensible Markup Language, is a way to structure data using tags, kind of like HTML. It's been widely used for everything from documents to configuration files to, yes, web services.
And then there's JSON, which seems to be everywhere these days.
Right. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's a bit more lightweight than XML. It's based on how objects are represented in JavaScript, which makes it really easy to use.
So how does Rails handle working with these two very different data formats?
Rails is friends with both. It's got excellent built-in support for working with XML and JSON.
So whether we're getting data from an XML-based API or sending data to a service that uses JSON, Rails can handle it seamlessly.
Absolutely. The book even shows you how to use Rails' built-in hash class to easily convert back and forth between your Ruby objects and either JSON or XML.
So convenient. No need to write a bunch of custom code just to handle the data conversion.
Nope. Rails takes care of all that for you, which is really nice.
I'm sensing a theme here. Rails likes to make developers' lives easier.
Right. And it does it so elegantly. It's really impressive the more you learn about it. It really is. It speaks to that bigger idea we've been talking about. Rails is all about making developers productive and, happy.
It's like the folks who created Rails sat down and said, how can we make this the most enjoyable development experience possible?
Because if you're fighting with your code all day, you're not going to get much done. You need that flow.
Exactly. Okay, we've covered so much today, from those nitty-gritty details of data formats to the big picture stuff like MVC and REST. What's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this deep dive?
I hope they realize that Rails is more than just a framework that's popular right now. The concepts in this book, even though it's about Rails 5 specifically, have had a huge influence on web development.
It's true. Agile workflows, DRY code, convention over configuration. Those are ideas that go way beyond any specific language or framework.
Exactly. So whether you're building the next big thing or just trying to understand how things work under the hood, those Rails fundamentals will give you a serious advantage.
It's like having the keys to the web development kingdom. So this deep dive has sparked your curiosity. I definitely recommend checking out the book or exploring some of the amazing online resources out there.
The Rails community is so welcoming, and there's a ton to learn.
This has been such an incredible journey through the world of Rails, and honestly, I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
There's always more to discover. Happy coding.